Hello, welcome to the next episode of our movie discussion podcast where we discuss whatever film we want. This week we are discussing Sin City and Whiplash. And also, I forgot to say this as well last time. I had to put this disclaimer in the title, but I'll just say this now. We are going to be extensively spoiling both films as well. So if you're interested in watching them and we both recommend them, just watch them before you listen to this podcast, or just watch it if you have already seen it. Okay.
Okay, with the spoiler stuff out of the way,
Yeah.
the warning. Shall we start on Sin City?
Yeah. Sin City, it came out in 2005. It, it's a bit hard to summarize the plot because it's
It's
got
an
like
adaptation of
multiple
a Frank
different.
Miller comic. It follows multiple characters as they go through, Basin City, and they go about their general duties. It's very much a noir story, so it follows, the sort of similar character archetypes that you'd expect. So you've got, the betrayed cop whose personal life has been made into a misery, but still just trying to save that one person. Got the big bruiser type who's done wrong in his life, but fell in love with this one woman, risks it all for her. You've got a murderer trying to escape his ways, but ultimately not being able to get away from his nature. And I think that's the main characters covered.
And you've got a couple of like bookending scenes. I want to specify character names. Marv is the bruiser. Hartigan is the cop. And I assume you're referring to Dwight as the murderer?
Yes, Dwight, yeah.
So yeah, this movie is based on the comic book series. And what's notable about Jack is that he absolutely loves comic books, like he like collects them. And that's different to me because although I've definitely read my fair share of like comic books, I'm not like hugely into them or anything. But I have actually read a couple of the Sin City books. I've read The Hard Goodbye, which is the Marv story in this one, and I've read A Dame to Kill For, which is the biggest story in the next Sin City film. But for the most part, I can kind of say that this is definitely one of the most accurate comic book adaptations that I've seen.
Well, I think
It's
what helps
almost
with
shot
that
for shot.
it is pretty much shot for shot. I think what really helps with that is Frank Miller was really, really involved in the creation process, and
Mhm.
he helped direct the film. I'm pretty sure he helped write it as well.
I don't think that there's even a screenplay credit because I don't think there was. Well, there was a need to write the script, obviously, but I don't think any of the dialogue was changed. I don't think the stories were changed at all. I think the stuff at the beginning and the end was maybe original.
Oh, I'm trying to remember now.
Yeah,
I'll
or
maybe
it could have just been the ending that was that was original when the beginning wasn't, or something. But regardless, like, so it's kind of it's like the best like kind of precursor to stuff like 300 or stuff like Watchmen, because those films not only utilized a similar like kind of ultra violent, very like special effects heavy kind of aesthetic, but they were also very like in terms of the translation from comic book to screen.
I must admit, though, I do think that Sin City kind of has an edge over those films as adaptations because they work. I think it works inherently more cinematically than a few more
Hmm.
do. It is grounded in such a almost a movie specific kind of genre because it is very much noir. And while you've got the hard boiled novels that kind of were precursors to noir, quite the same thing. And I think, especially with Sin City, I think it is the perfect representation of Frank Miller's writing style because
Hmm.
everything about the film just screams this almost this black and white thinking, this very bleak sense of hope that gets intermittently crushed and brought back and problematized throughout the film. You've got these incredibly stoic, aging, broken characters doing the last thing they know how to do. I think it's probably the pinnacle of Frank Miller's writing, the good and the bad.
I think that this is easily like the best film that he's had his like name attached to. It's also an extremely like aggressive film. The reason why like comic books often make for like big blockbusters is because like they often have like wild crazy visuals. There's a lot of big outlandish action in them. And oftentimes that gets translated into a comic book, and that's very much the case for like the Sin City books. But also the thing that kind of appropriate for a film is because not only is there like way more action than you'd see in like a typical like noir movie or like a 40s noir film, but this is also an incredibly violent film as well. It's the kind of thing that like you can really emphasize and really do well in a film, like more so in a comic book, you know? Obviously in a comic book you can show violence, but in a film you can really like make the audience wince and cringe. And Sin City is probably the most like I think it might be the most violent comic book adaptation I've ever seen. And I've seen a lot of like comic book movies, and I can't think of that many that are more violent than this one.
No, there's one or two that I would probably say would be contenders, but I think, especially with the sound design and the violence of this film, I think sound design is something this film really does have going for it. And I'm not even talking about the visuals yet because they deserve like a much longer discussion.
Mhm.
But the sound, the sound design, the way you do get these very very wet, crunchy sounds, and everything just feels hard and liquid because you've got that bone crunching. The every punch seems to just echo ever so
Mhm.
ever so slightly. You've got the wet sounds of blood coming off or muscle.
There are so many scenes where people just get punched in the face as well. Like sometimes out of nowhere, and sometimes like there are so many like torture bits. Sometimes the violence is outright like cartoonish as well, you know, in some scenes. But it's just so like brutal and so like consistent that almost after a while it turns darkly comedic. But there are only maybe a couple of scenes that are genuinely like played for laughs. But the film has kind of earned the right to play some of its violence for laughs because for the most part, it takes itself like very seriously.
Yeah, I do think it is an immensely serious film. I think captures what neo noir tries to be quite well. It adds that extra level of violence. It takes away the suggestion of the original noir while keeping the
Yeah.
visual style. And I want to just have a moment to talk about the visuals because I
Mhm.
think this is one of the more visually unique films I've seen in a while. I think the closest thing that I would compare it to in terms of like a color palette style would be Schindler's List. Oddly,
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah, I get that. The selective use of color, but mostly black and white.
I mean, obviously it looks very very different, but it's the same sort of technique. And I like the fact that in the film, it's the reds or the yellows that are highlighted. So it's more things like jealousy and blood and violence and passion. Those are the three things that kind of get touched on, and the color theory of the film kind of goes with that because those are the colors. Those are the colors that it brings out. So I was very 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 impressed with that. I think it was a really really good move from the colorist and probably DOP as well.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like some of the scenes where color is used, and I think like anytime it is used, it grabs your attention, but also it emphasizes certain things. Like to give you an example, so there's that sequence in the car where Dwight is driving. It's that really weird, again, kind of darkly comic, like just bizarre scene where Jackie Boy, the guy who's just been killed, like despite being clearly dead, he's just like talking as if he's alive.
Yeah,
And in it, you see the reflection of like I think it's like green or like yeah, it's like the reflection of various colors, and I think it just adds to the surreal atmosphere. And it does make you wonder, like, is Dwight just imagining him, or is Jackie Boy somehow still alive?
and given what characters can survive in this film, you kind of do sit there and you're like, I would buy it if he wasn't, if he wasn't dead. Like it's because I think that's something brilliant about the film. Actually, it really does immerse you into its world, and it
Mhm.
does make the world a very unstable and both easy and difficult to understand at the same time. I think that's really something about it as well.
The amount of like trauma that certain characters go through, you do kind of wonder like how they can survive it. But the world is heightened enough where you can kind of buy it. So the way that Marv's story concludes, it concludes with him getting the electric chair, and they have to do it twice. But because of the way that Marv is being characterized, like what you've seen about him, you could conceivably buy that they'd have to do like two jolts of electricity to like finish him off. The other thing that I think kind of grounds this film as well, despite how like absurd and cartoonish it is that like each of the stories do have this very like strong undercurrent of men and women as well fighting against corruption. If there are any like central antagonists in this film, it's the Rourke family
Yeah.
because they kind of factor into almost every story. Or they factor into the first story featuring Marv, and they factor into the beginning and ending story, that yellow bastard, featuring Hartigan, because like in many respects they're the ones responsible for it, but for these bad things that happen.
Mm.
But even in the middle story, you have Jackie Boy, who's this rated cop, but he's also like an abusive shithead, and a general scumbag. And or even you have like Manute, who's supposed to be like the enforcer for this like unseen mobster. So despite like the absurdity of the film, there is this genuine sense of like, as you said, hopelessness, but also this kind of sense of like get revenge on a corrupt system.
Yeah, I think what's really quite fascinating about the film is, the message it does send about that ability to fight the system. Because on some levels, all the protagonists on some level win. You've got Marv, who he gets killed with an electric chair throughout the film, but he kills Kevin, he kills the cardinal of the Rourke family, who kind of
Yeah.
set everything up in the first place. He stops a cannibal, and yeah, sure, like the system doesn't turn around and blame him for it, and it obviously does perpetuate itself because the cardinal's son is still the senator. But
Hmm.
Marv gets to do what he wants. He gets to avenge Goldie's death,
Yeah.
and he gets to go out violently, which is kind of the best ending that his character was ever going to have. He's almost a dead man walking throughout the film anyway, and he
Hmm.
knows it because he's kind of lost his taste for violence, but at the same time, it's the only thing that keeps him going. Like he tries to convince himself that he's lost his taste for it, but
Hmm.
he doesn't ever in the
He
film. And I
tries to
think,
convince himself that he's crazy too. But to be honest, he actually is a lot more sane than many of the other characters, I would say.
yeah, I would agree with that. And I think a lot of the characters are trying to hold on to some image of themselves that their actions really do show to be wrong. And I find that a really, really interesting character dynamic. And I think it's one of the few instances where I like quite a lot of narration in a film, because usually it can be a bit hit or miss.
It's like the internal monologue, so therefore it's not like we're seeing like a character kind of explain stuff or telling the story. It's more like we're seeing their internal thoughts and their comments on a situation.
It's almost like the perfect cinematic representation of reading a comic book, not with the little text, but bubbles and all of that. It still kind of keeps itself cinema, but sure, it perfectly captures the feeling of reading a Frank Miller comic book.
Yeah.
That's something that I really, really enjoyed about the film, because it was Frank Miller at its peak, and I think Robert Rodriguez did a really, really good job at helping. I mean, I know Frank Miller was there to help him direct it as well, but I think
Hmm.
Rodriguez, he definitely brought the action to be very, very exciting, and he was able to capture all of the very comic booky violence, like the 2 feet through the car door when Marv jumped through that windshield,
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
or I think it had that same sense of energy and momentum that you get from things like Mariachi and Desperado.
Yeah.
But it still kept the very slower paced, more noir sensibilities, and I think those two visuals together, those styles really complemented each other in a way that I really didn't expect them to.
Despite obviously it being very Miller focused, I do think this film could also be called like the best Tarantino film that he never made, because so Tarantino did have a part in this
Mm.
film. He directed the scene where Jackie Boy's like speaking despite being dead. But aside from that, he didn't have anything else to do with it. But weirdly, this film does feel kind of like Rodriguez's like Pulp Fiction, essentially. Like
Yeah,
it feels very like obviously you have a similar like kind of structure to Pulp Fiction in that you have like these individual stories that kind of link up to each other. In tone, it kind of feels like the perfect marriage between the sort of action blockbuster sensibilities of Rodriguez, but also the kind of ultra violent, witty, dark humor of Tarantino as well.
I think it is a very, very good blend of both of those things. I think it's just got some very, very impactful moments with
Yeah,
Hartigan's death at the end, for instance. I think
yeah,
I think that is the epitome of bleak hopefulness, because
yeah. It
on the
is.
one hand, he saved Nancy. On the other hand, he
Mhm.
fucking shot himself in the mouth. He's dead. Bittersweet's not even the word. It is just bleak hope. That's what it is, because he's kind of there like, okay, I can't get out of this, but
Mhm.
she might. And
Yeah. Hmm.
and then when it goes to that completely whited out silhouette of Hartigan, and the bullet goes through, I think that was just almost because it takes you out of it. It's almost more emotional in a way, because it kind of brings you to that moment, and I just thought that was really evocative, because it takes away the identity, and it kind of makes you sit there and you can go, oh, that's just how this world works. And I think
Yeah.
that feeling is just, it's part of what then sells the rest of the film still to you right at the end as well. And then, well,
Mhm.
not quite right at the end. I mean, there are the Hitman bookends. The end of that story, it kind of which keeps it feeling more believable.
The Marv story and the Hartigan stories, you could argue, are kind of like tragedies,
Yeah,
because both of them are about like yeah, people who are on like borrowed time, but even despite that, they're still like doing the best that they can to defeat the bad guy and do something for somebody, for like the woman that they love, whether that be like somebody that they barely knew, or maybe or like a little kid who then grew up to be an adult. But that's kind of what makes it like satisfying as well. Because the thing about this film is that I think it could have very easily been, a machismo like action flick about like tough guys just like killing people, torturing people, and whatever. But one of the things that prevents that is that you have flawed tough guys going up against pure evil. All of the antagonists in Sin City are completely incapable of like redemption or even showing any sign of goodness. Like they're all pure evil. Like Rourke is Senator Rourke is pure evil. Cardinal Rourke is pure evil. Kevin is pure evil. Rourke Jr. is pure evil. Even Manu is pure evil, and obviously you have Jackie Boy as well. So that kind of makes it a bit more like palatable. It kind of makes you okay with watching these not necessarily heroic people fighting against these other people. But also, I think that the film, it does have that undercurrent of heart as well. Like, despite being dark, there is a decent amount of heart, whether it be like Hartigan. Like his storylines are easily the most emotional, and that's partially just because he goes through so much awful shit. But it's also because there is that strong heart of the fact that I mean, out of all the protagonists, he's the most heroic.
yeah,
In
he
fact,
is.
I'd call him probably the most saintly as well, because like to me, the Hartigan character, he's almost like Sin City's version of Jesus Christ. He suffers so much for other people, and how he even gets betrayed by one of his followers. Bob at the beginning, his partner betrays him. So that's another Christ parallel. But so there's that like kind of heart to it, and there's also the heart in Dwight's story as well. Because Dwight does genuinely give a shit about people. Like he cares about Shelley, still likes Gale. So as a result, because you have these genuine things of like compassion, I think that kind of offsets it from being too unpleasant.
I think it's got those very, very human moments in it that really do stop it from being miserable, and it kind of gives it it's almost a world you definitely wouldn't want to be a part of. It's a world that you kind of think could get better, even though it probably won't. A big part that keeps us invested in the stories because it doesn't
Mhm.
quite extinguish any sense that the world could be a good place. It's very, very bad. And I think that works wonders for just from an investment standpoint. I really wanted to touch on one aspect of the film that I found a bit more troubling as I was watching. I found, some of the relationships and the gender politics were quite uncomfortable in the film.
I was wondering how we were going to like move into that. So, I mean, obviously, you could say that this isn't helped by like Miller's like other works as well and perception of that. So let's not bring up stuff like All Star Batman and Robin and other stuff like that, and just focus on this film. Like watching the film, like yeah, there is some stuff that I agree hasn't aged that well. For the most part, I don't think it's like too offensive or anything like that. There's only really one aspect to the film, that like one consistent theme that I did think was a bit of a problem. And that's that like throughout the film, obviously every single storyline, I would say this strong theme of men saving women, of men being the saviors of women, of men being the only ones capable of saving women, and of women not necessarily being able to save themselves. I've
Yeah,
noticed.
yeah, because I found it really odd because you had the whole thing with the old town and the prostitutes that kind of controlled that area and seemed like they should be able to protect themselves. They still needed Dwight to come in and save the day and stop it, even though the women should have been on paper from what they could do with their actions far more capable, and
Yeah.
that was quite a thing. Although that bothered me less than the relationship between Hartigan and Nancy. I found that deeply, deeply uncomfortable. I think that's where the flawed side of Askin came in, because obviously it's this. He saved her when she was 11 years old, and then he becomes 19, and then he should have known that that was somewhere that he shouldn't go, like emotionally, and it's and and it becomes understandable in a way. It's the only company that he has for 8 years, but while he's in prison, her letter's the only thing that he's got. But at the same time, he makes the point that he's old enough to be a grandfather and things like that, and that's
Yeah.
yeah. I think the bigger problem is that it's very, very clearly a case of hero worship, and there's no genuine love to that. And he doesn't quite let himself just succumb to it, but he does in a way that he shouldn't at times.
I do kind of agree. Like, what I think they were going for. So he does love her, obviously, but at first it is like a father loves a daughter. Although he doesn't like that she's become like a stripper. As a result of that, he's starting to confuse love with lust and fatherly love with romantic love. You could say that that's an internal conflict, best exemplified in the bit that where they're in that, like, I think, like motel room or whatever, where on the one hand he's like warding off her advances because she's fallen out in love with him, but it's like he's obviously in conflict, like he doesn't want to, and then they start like making out and stuff, and then he like pushes himself away. But I think that scene is a bit, although it's a bit awkward, I agree, it is slightly remedied by him at the end just saying I love you too. I feel like that's a very sincere moment, and I think to some degree that's him saying that even if he doesn't love her romantically, he still does love her. But I agree, it's a bit, it is quite awkward.
I think it actually adds to the world, because it is such an uncomfortable relationship. I think my problem with the way it's presented like it's almost presented like it's okay, almost. And I think if it was a little more clearly presented as something that's wrong, or at the very least, a bit more complicated than it was, I think that would have really, really helped.
If it had gone into kind of Nancy's like psyche or whatever, like, or it kind of pointed out that maybe even Nancy had some kind of internal conflict or whatever, if it had done stuff like that, then you could have thought to yourself, like, okay, well, it's not as simple as just like she's in love with him. It's like, like it's like she owes a debt to him, but she's also kind of, given how he's probably the only person who's ever been nice to her, she probably would have feelings of love. And it's like so there is stuff that could have been dived into, but for the most part you just see it from Hartigan's perspective. What I would say I more had an issue with was I think was Marv's storyline. And the main reason why is because so in the Marv story, he's had this one night stand with Goldie, this prostitute, and then after she's been killed, like he's going on this like semi clear my name, but mainly just get revenge plotline. And then you have Goldie's sister Wendy who comes in, and she also wants revenge too. The thing I have about this storyline is that although obviously the Marv character is a really interesting character, I personally feel like he's kind of taking away from what would be a more emotionally resonant, more kind of I'd use this word, but like female empowering story that would have just been focused on Wendy. She's the one with like this sisterly relationship. She hasn't been framed for murder, but she's in like an even less like capable position than Marv. I do wonder if that storyline would have been better if it wasn't focused on Marv.
I don't know, because I think the story really, really worked. I do think that Wendy should have been more involved with it for sure, and I would actually have loved to see. It's hard because I love Marv as a character. I want him to have a story, but I think you're right. I think that story is perhaps maybe not the one that he should have had if Wendy was involved. I think part of that's the time it was written, which isn't an excuse for it at all. But obviously, when the story was written, there was a lot less of a female protagonist in that kind of story, especially with very male-driven comic book writing at the time.
And how often do you see like noir films that are focused on, that are focused on female protagonists? Oftentimes it's the male protagonist.
I think if the film was to be revisited or re-examined, I think Wendy should have been the focus of that story and should have been more involved. And I think she should have been able to, kill Kevin. I think
it is mitigated despite the fact that they barely knew each other. You can understand why Marv would have fallen in love with Goldie.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, the story as it is works very, very well. You know, and I do enjoy it. I just kind of, again, do also see your point
Hmm.
about. I don't know. It might have worked better if it was more of a partnership kind of deal. It's been quite an interesting thing to deal with, or you know, following Wendy, and she kind of hears about Marv doing these things. We do see Marv do these things as well, but we kind of get it more from Wendy's perspective. I think it was, you know, I think it would be something that would be interesting, but obviously
Yeah.
not the way the film works because it's less a criticism and more a, oh, that would have been neat.
And one thing I did as well when I was watching the film was I was taking note of how long each storyline was, like how many minutes, I mean. And the Marv story was like about 30 minutes, and the Dwight story was like 40 minutes. So I do wonder if they could have, if it like, I mean, if they were going to make Marv's story any longer, that's probably what they could have done to expand it and maybe make it deeper. But at the same time, I mean, it might have caused the film to like drag. You know, I mean, so the film is like 2 hours long. On my first viewing, I did find it a bit too long, but on my second viewing, I thought it flowed quite well.
I think it flows really well as a film. You know, it works. There's a couple of places where you know it drags a little bit more as you kind of get the creeping creeping sense. But then for me, that kind of builds a sense of dread and anticipation that kind of runs the film.
Yeah, I would say the only part of the film that could maybe have been cut or condensed or something is probably just the Dwight storyline. It goes from Dwight taking out Jackie Boy or Dwight getting Miho to take out Jackie Boy. So all of a sudden, like, oh shit, Jackie Boy's a cop. This could like throw the truce between the cops and Old Town into like disarray or whatever. So obviously you can understand it getting a bit more complex, but then all of a sudden you have the process of trying to like dispose of the body and then the body of Jackie Boy and then some Irish mercenaries get control of the body and all of that stuff in between. I think could have maybe been a bit condensed.
Sure, you know, I think there were elements of it that were just kind of, oh, okay. And while I was, you know, I was enjoying them, but at the same time, from a pure narrative perspective, they weren't necessary. For example, why didn't he just get the head? If he got the head in the sewers and got in the sewer and gotten there, it wouldn't have changed anything about the story. Yeah, it would have robbed us of one car chase, but it wasn't a particularly interesting car chase. I mean, it works, but it wasn't
Mhm.
like you know, it wasn't like
Yeah,
some chases earlier in the film. It was kind of just, oh, there are still some mercenaries. Okay,
I would probably say that that bit was the most like filler-ish section of the film, but that's just because it was more of a connective tissue as a way to like get the Jackie Boy head to the point to where it could be put in that transfer situation, that
yeah,
climaxes that story. Um, and that story does have the most abrupt ending of
that's
all of them as well.
yeah, it does, and I think Joe, that's why I think I wanted him to have gotten the head in the sewer because it's where he meets the explosive expert,
Hmm.
it's where he probably got the explosives to begin with anyway.
Hmm.
And if he got in their head at the same time, it would have just you didn't need the car chase.
I do also think that like although the Dwight story does end a bit abruptly, I feel like all of the stories in general have very like satisfying beginning, middle, and ends. I especially like the choice to split up the Hardican story because that is also kind of a book ending as well. It's like the main story that you begin with and the main story that you end with, and there's like a passage of time that progresses as well.
Yeah, and it kind of gives you the passage of time in the story as well because it's you know it
Yeah,
lets you feel the 8 years a bit, and it also gives it a nice sense of poetic when it's you know with where you get to repeat that a young girl lives, an old man dies, fair
fair
trade.
trade. Yeah.
Which is good. Although I must admit, from a purely logical storytelling perspective, it might have been better to have a couple of the scenes that were in the second segment, in the first segment, like when he's in the hospital and things like that, and then start with his time in prison. That might have worked a bit better, but then I
I
I don't
disagree.
think that. Okay,
Because and the only reason why I'm saying that is just because it makes it a bit of a surprise. Because the way that the first story ends, you think that Hardigan dies, and I think it's good to like hold off on going back to that story for a while. So therefore, you then it's then more of a surprise and a shock when he turns out to still be alive. And also another good thing as well is that like it kind of helps for the because even though each of the stories are self-contained, the film does still have to try and follow like the three act structure.
yeah,
So therefore, and as part of that, it's like you have Nancy, who is in a couple of scenes, and then she comes into play into the climax as well. So it's kind of good, like I guess you could say Chekhov's gun or like foreshadowing. And also it's kind of good as well. It's like, you have the antagonist in the first half, and then you have that same antagonist come back in a different form, Rourke Jr. At the end as well. Like I do kind of like how just unapologetically sleazy this film is as well. Like it pulls no punches in regards to like, depicting a cannibalist, a corrupt like domestic abuser, a corrupt senator. What else? Like, oh yeah, and the ultimate thing, Rourke Jr., the serial killer pedophile. I do wonder if Sin City at the time was a bit game changing, because I can't think of any other like such hot like hardcore comic book films that really focused on that kind of evil.
No, not really, because you had the ones that followed, characters with dark pasts, like a history of violence that were really,
Mhm.
really violent and things like that. And you had a couple grittier ones at the time. I think Sin City is just a very, very unique beast. I think there are things that are somewhat comparable, and I think every the only ones that are somewhat comparable are also based at least partially on Frank Miller's work. I think the closest thing superhero wise that kind of deals with that for me, that kind of world, that incredibly bleak as well, where things just go wrong, is probably Netflix's Daredevil. Like almost the nearest that you get in terms of having that that kind of hard edged character with a bit of the with a bit of the Catholic moments, except not quite so violent as Marv's. You have those moments interspersed with moments of extreme violence. I think it is the closest you get. But even then, it's not Sin City. I think Sin City is its ultra violence really sets it apart from other films because it's a very very stylized and impossible to achieve human wise, which kind of puts you
Mhm.
on another level with humans. But
Yeah.
in the film, but it also gives you this sense of this overwhelmingly bleak and horrible sense that kind of sells the overwhelmingly bleak and horrible world.
And what kind of also makes it a bit more palatable as well was like the dialogue as well,
Yeah,
because we know that like Frank Miller's dialogue would really go off the rails, but this did kind of prove that he did have a bit of a mastery of it. Because this is a very very quotable film to the point where like how stuff like the Star Wars prequels or like original Spider-Man films, how like those movies have just been like memed to death. I'm
yeah,
kind of surprised that Sin City hasn't gone through a similar phrase of like memeing, because there's a lot of like lines that you could turn into memes, or a lot of lines that you could just quote, like to give it like, especially all of like Marv's lines, like like him saying like, it's a damn fine coat you're wearing, I love hitmen, no matter what you do to them you don't feel bad, or like the heaven, the hell I'm gonna send him to will feel like heaven after what I've done to him. All of these like quotes, or even like stuff that Dwight says, like, "Hi, I'm Shelley's new boyfriend, and I'm out of my mind." There's a lot of like really good lines that really like stick with you and really just like and just get a reaction out of you.
yeah. It's quite. They're quite evocative. And they sell all these characters as troubled, violent lunatics, which is
Hmm.
kind of what all of them ultimately are to a degree. I mean,
Hmm.
Karstigan has an obsessive heroes complex that just doesn't let him die, even when he perhaps really should. He can't give up, and that's he's got that obsessive level of insanity. Marv's grip on reality is tenuous at best, and Clyde is just this kind of violent monster who's almost trying to direct that in a good way.
I actually think that Dwight, you could argue, is a bit more of a, but like kind of like Hartigan. Dwight is a bit more of a traditional hero.
I don't see that at all. Actually, I see that unlike Hartigan, a lot of his violence is protective, but I think unlike Hartigan, he enjoys it in a way that you shouldn't as a hero. And I think
Hmm.
and
Okay, I
I
can
also
see
think
that.
I think part of the reason he does act is less to protect, less to be protective, and more because these kind of people just annoy him, and it gives him an excuse, as opposed to being actually driven to protect. I think he likes the
Okay.
excuse.
On the one hand, I do kind of disagree, and that's just because, again, I do think that Dwight, he's kind of like the guy who is trying to solve problems all throughout the film. The entire storyline is like, oh shit, we can't let this turn into like an all-out war, or so all-out like gang war. So it's like his attempts at preventing it. But at the same time, in his character, I can kind of see what you're talking about. He seems fairly like desensitized to violence. You know, he doesn't like he doesn't really care. You know, unlike Marv or unlike Hartigan, he doesn't seem to care about the violence that surrounds him. You know, he just seems again desensitized. There's that bit in the Marv story where he walks into the bar and you see Dwight, and you see him give a bit of an internal monologue, and he says like, no, I don't see Marv as a brute, I just see him as being born in the wrong century. If he was in Roman times, he'd fit right in, or something like that. And he's kind of justifying, you know, Marv's like brutish ways, you know, like he's saying like, and he's saying, I don't see anything insane about this guy. So I can see what you mean in that regard.
Yeah, well, I do definitely see your point about him being a traditional hero. I just hesitate, especially with Sin City and Frank Miller's writing in general. I always hesitate to use the word hero because just
Anti-hero is a better term.
yeah, I think or even just bad people who happen to be doing good. I don't even think terms like hero and villain apply to Frank Miller characters quite a
Hmm.
lot. I mean, obviously you get the. I mean, some of them are pure evil. I think villain applies a lot more readily than hero does. But I do find Frank Miller's characters just these insurmountable forces of will, and
Hmm.
I think the black and white really helps sell that because it gives them this very absolutist thinking that runs the film, and I
Hmm.
think the long shots of just them taking damage and just stepping forward, and the way that the
Hmm.
camera lingers on them while this
Yeah.
happens, I just think it really sells that insurmountable will aspect, and I think in a way it's this darkly inspirational thing that you might get fucked up and you might die, but you can win while you're doing it. I think
Yeah.
I find that quite an interesting thing about the film, and I think it's one of the reasons that I really love it.
I think maybe the strongest aspect of this film, and this is something that I don't often like praising in films because I think it's like it's not I don't always think it's that noteworthy. But I have to say the cast and casting in this film is spot on. Like
Yeah,
it's
the casting
the
is really
casting is spot on, but the acting all around is easily, I think it's maybe the reason why this film works. It's one of the reasons why this film works, I think.
it's such a pulpy film that if you didn't cast it right, then the lines would not feel believable. It wouldn't sell you. But I think the way that people they embody their characters and convict them, you kind of get this massive range from everyone of different things. And for some people, it's quite subtle, like Bruce Willis. I think Bruce Willis is very much a subtle actor.
In this film, it was so good being reminded of how good of an actor he can be,
Yeah,
because like, you know, in like all the time he just perfectly sells that like torment, but still that will to survive and help somebody. And you know, he's like he's got the perfect voice for the role. He looks perfect. It was a bit funny when he was referred to as being like 60, because he really did not look 60 at all. He looked like he was like 50, maybe. But he didn't
yeah.
quite look like an old man.
To be fair, 60 is not that old. Like it is, but it's
No.
also not like I don't know. I find the area around 40 to 70 can be really ambiguous. I think what I thought was really important is you just got these characters that were once vulnerable and impassive, and the people they cast for it as well have these very quiet emotions, very quiet kind of characters in there. You don't get this wildness from any of them, but you get such a range. Like Clive Owen, for example, this is
Mhm.
probably my favourite performance from him outside of Children of Men.
I have grown to like him as Dwight, because when I first saw the film, I'll be honest, I actually thought that he was the weak link. But as I think about it more, I do think I was probably misjudging him, and I do think that I do think that he does do quite a good job. But compared to Bruce Willis, or even especially Mickey Rourke
Oh, Mick,
as the Marv character, I do think that he doesn't quite fit as well, but I do think that his acting is good. You know, I do think that it could just be like the accent that he's putting on. I think because compared to like Willis or Rourke, who just naturally sound like these characters, you can tell that Owen is kind of putting on an accent. But despite that, he's still very appropriate for the role of Dwight.
I think the problem with the Dwight story in general is that it goes on a bit too long and isn't as connected to everything else. So it
Hmm.
always feels like I think that holds that part back quite a bit because with Marv you can see how it feeds into the overall Hartigan story because it gives
Hmm.
you the information of Rourke, we know that name. Oh,
Hmm.
Rourke Junior was okay. and then the Cardinals made his son the senator, who's made his son. Oh, okay, and that kind of clicks.
Yeah.
So that when you get to the Hartman story, it gives you the context. But the Clyde one kind of gives you the idea of there's being mobs and influence, but it doesn't do much else. It helps build the world out a bit, but it doesn't
hmm
service the main plot as well. And I think, while I really like the sequence, I feel like you could lose most of that story and it wouldn't matter to the
Maybe.
narrative.
Yeah. To bring it back to Clive Owen, do you think that Clive Owen like carries that entire storyline and makes it more effective than it could
I
have
would
been?
put it just on his shoulders. Rosario Dawson's great as always. Michael Clark Duncan gives this very, very imposing performance that really works.
Yeah.
I didn't like Becky. I didn't think that worked. I didn't believe her betraying them particularly because they
Oh,
just
okay.
talk. That also was a problem with me with Clive's story. Some of the characters weren't really properly set up for me, and I just didn't care about them as much.
Okay.
I think Clive Owen and Rosario Dawson and Michael Clark Duncan really helped bring it up.
I have to say that this is like if you want a perfect microcosm of what actors were popular in the 2000s, then I think that this is one of the best examples of that. If you saw this film when it came out, you would have been like, "Oh yeah, that guy, I know him from this film." Or you would have said like, "Oh, that guy who has appeared in a bunch of films, he's now appearing in this one." Like obviously you have some more like long-term people like Bruce Willis or even like Mickey Rourke to an extent, but also you have other people in there too. Like you have Josh Hartnett as the
Yeah,
as the hitman. You have Nick Stahl as Rourke Jr., who was previously in Terminator 3 as John Connor. You've got Michael Madsen. I mean,
well,
he's a bit more long term, but
I
yeah,
I thought that was actually quite a good performance. I really liked that. I mean, I know it's quite a small one, but it really sold me because you get the sense that he does care about Hartigan, but he also likes the money more. You kind of get that real, and like he just feels corrupt. Everything he says and everything he does. I mean, because he is, but
yeah,
you kind of really do get that impression from the character, and you get that, and he builds a relationship really well with Bruce Willis, where you kind of with Bruce Willis's character, where you kind of get just old history between them, and this modicum of tension that doesn't actually matter too much between them. Like there
yeah.
is tension, but it's not like either one of them gives a shit. And I think that's quite. I think that's just a very, very interesting dynamic. I think it's because the actors play off each other so well.
There's a great line where he says, "Hell of a way to end a partnership after like knocking Bob out."
Mm.
But yeah, I mean, I did. I mean, if I did have one problem, it's that like in the first scene between them, I did think that the dialogue that Bob was saying felt a bit, and this could maybe be delivery, or I think it was the writing. The dialogue that Bob was saying was very unnatural. The dialogue that
Yeah,
Hartigan was saying worked, but the dialogue that Bob was saying was a bit weird.
well, I disagree with you. I don't think any of the dialogue in that first section worked. And I was like, when it was that first conversation between him and Bob, I did not like it. I thought it felt very exposition heavy. It didn't make sense
Yeah,
at
from
all.
Bob's perspective, I agree. I can't remember
Well,
anything about Hartigan's
I think when
words,
he went,
whatever
oh
he
yeah,
said.
he was like, yeah, Nancy Callahan, 11-year-old girl. It was a bit like, cool, thanks for just giving us the description. You wouldn't, to me, it didn't feel right. You wouldn't have done it. Like if he literally just said, look, there's a little girl, something like, there's a little girl in there. Like, there's a little girl in there. I'm going. That would
Mhm.
have felt more natural than,
Oh,
Nancy
okay.
Callahan, 11 years old, blah blah blah.
Did he actually say that
Yeah, he
to
did.
Bob? Okay. Oh, okay. All right. I don't. I thought he was that was just in his monologue, but no, he said it out loud. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I agree. I agree with what you're saying. Again, I think it's more. But I saw it more from Bob's angle. That his words were kind of very strange and awkward. Oh, and probably the most like bizarre but quite effective one. Elijah Wood as Kevin. At the time, I don't think anybody would expect him to play like a mute cannibal, but he is quite creepy looking.
He gives that Marv story just this extra level of just creep and almost like there's just unsettling moment. I think it plays well against Mickey Rourke's very quite stoic and aggressive performance. And it's
It,
like almost this calm, almost this, he's got this almost calm way that he does it, but it's this calm aggression that he kind of has, and I think it plays off really well because he's the only character that doesn't
I
react.
like the character contrast in the Marv story because in the Marv story, Kevin is kind of the villain. I like the contrast between like him and Marv. Like he's a young, agile, mute, pure evil, cannibal and serial killer as well. Whereas you have Marv, this like old, brutish, grizzly, like is outwardly violent but has a heart. Like you have that contrast between the two, and you also have a similar contrast between like Hardigan and Rourke Jr. You have the grizzled old, man with a heart of gold, whereas you have, the young, evil, totally like in the Rourke case, you have like an old man who goes through so much shit versus like a young, spoiled guy who, at the end of the first story, gets his like nuts blown off. He gets like brutalized, but he still comes back, just with a yellow appearance. So I think that character writing is good. And the final thing I just want to point out about the cast as well is that like watching it does feel a bit like sad as well because the actors that are in it are dead. Like at least four of them. Like that, like Michael Clark Duncan, Rutger Hauer, Powers Booth, and especially in a turn that I thought was like really good, Brittany Murphy as Shelley. I thought that she did a really really excellent job for for a role that's like not that big. I thought that she did a really great job. I think she even outacted Benicio del Toro as well.
Yeah.
So that was just a talent gone way too soon. So I do think that that aspect it does kind of make the film a bit more like of a sad watch, like seeing these like famous actors who are all dead. But but it is kind of but it's still good to obviously watch them like giving really like good performances.
So yeah, I think that wraps us up on Sin City. Do you have any closing thoughts?
Like despite some flaws, I do think it's a really good film. I do think it's quite. I would say it's essential viewing for anybody who's like a comic book fan or anybody who just wants to see the kind of interesting, unique things that can be done with a comic book adaptation.
If you're a big fan of neo noir, if you're a fan of Frank Miller in general, it's very very visually arresting. I think that's something that really should be taken into account when you're going to view it because I think it's one of the most unique visual films that you'll see.
Hmm.
So I think it's
Yeah.
worth it for that alone. The performances are phenomenal, and it's just a really fantastic display of the kind of stories that can be told within a noir world, and it's one of the better world buildings that I've seen. So
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
I would say it was very very worth it.